points of information, and the speakers who has the floor may choose to accept or decline a point when it is over. At 7 minutes, the timekeeper will again signal once, like this. After this, no more point of information may be offered for the rest of the speech. At 8 minutes, the timekeeper will make the double signal. After this, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds. There will be a short break at the end of each speech for the judges to complete their notes. After the 6 main speeches, each team will have the opportunity to make a 4-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speaker on each team. No point of information are allowed during reply speeches. The opposition will make their reply speech first, and after 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. Before the debate begins, I would like to remind you to switch off all of mobile phones and anything else which might disturb the debaters. Should you need to leave or re-enter the room for any reason during the debate, please wait until the end of the speech to do so. Audience members should be aware that they may not participate in the main debate. There will be an opportunity to make comments after the judges have left the room at the end of the debate. Finally, audience members should be aware that this debate is allowed to be recorded. I would now like to introduce the judges for this debate. They are Agrin Singh from Singapore, who is the chair judge for today's debate. Michelian Grönlund from Sweden. And Elias from Qatar. In proposition for this debate, we have the team from Canada. The first speaker is Armin Sabavi. The second speaker will be Himati Moruri. The third speaker will be Dasha Metropolitansky, and the reply speech will be delivered by Armin Sabavi. And in opposition, we have the team from Philippines. Their first speaker is Abhinav Batula. The second speaker will be Ignacio Villarreal. The third speaker will be Abhishek Kotamashu, and the reply speech will be delivered by Ignacio Villarreal. The motion for this debate is this House will make labor union membership compulsory in large industries. Now let's begin the debate by inviting the first speaker for the proposition team to open the debate. Please welcome Armin Sabavi.
In the 21st century, the means of production have become concentrated in the hands of fewer people than ever before. The power to exploit millions of the most vulnerable workers in large industries the world over is more a threat today than it has ever been. Unions are the engine of resistance against this tyranny, and it is for that reason that Team Canada recognizes that the working class will sink or swim together, which is why we are proud to propose with the case line, united we stand, divided we fall. Team Canada will outline now a several-part model. First, we believe all those who wish to be employed must become union members as a condition of employment. Second, all existing employees must become union members as a condition of continued employment. Third, each union member will pay union dues and have one vote in union elections. Finally, to talk about large-scale industries, we believe that this is specific to countries, but we think it relies on a number of factors. First, the number of employees it hires. Second, the contribution to a country's economy. And third, the profit that industry makes. Some examples include the auto industry in the United States, the textile industry in Bangladesh, banana farming in Panama, and the telecom industry in India. Team Proposition will bring you 3 arguments today. First, democracy in the workplace. Second, the critical mass of resistance. And third, political power united. Team Canada will win this debate by proving to you 3 things. First, that it is just to limit individual choice for collective democratic rights. Second, that unions are an effective check on corporate power. And third, that compulsory membership is effective at ensuring that that power is exercised well. Let's move on to Team Canada's first constructive argument, democracy in the workplace. The premise of this argument is that unions serve critical democratic functions and that it is just to limit individual choice to protect the democratic rights of all other people. In society, there are huge power imbalances between the powers that be and the people. In society, it's the state and citizens, and in the workplace, it's the corporation and workers. Corporations have extreme power over workers because they control their wage, which is literally their means of subsistence, ladies and gentlemen. When they threaten to fire a worker, it is a minimal injury to that company because they can replace that worker, but it is devastating to that individual worker because they have no choice but to work in order to survive. It is for that reason that workers need some united voice to check corporate power, like democracy does against the state. How is it that unions serve this democratic function? Union members vote for leaders who, with union infrastructure, represent workers in ways that they simply cannot themselves. For example, with strikes, to ensure that there is democratic protection in the workplace. Why is compulsory membership necessary to protect this democracy? First, the free rider dilemma. All individual workers benefit from the activity of unions. They all benefit from higher wages and all benefit from better conditions. So we think it is a moral imperative for all workers to contribute to that which they benefit from. And for individual workers to not do so, we think is morally wrong. But second, the ability of each worker to get protection is dependent on other workers joining in the effort with them. For example, a company can't fire all union members, which is the only reason why companies have to acquiesce to their demands, because the cost of firing all the people who strike is greater than the cost of acquiescing to the demands. Why are unions the only institutions that can provide democratic representation? First, because they protect workers in unique ways. While states can set things like a universal minimum wage, individual unions can put specific pushes for specific wages in specific companies. Second, unions can amplify individual voices. So if a company withholds a worker's pension, then the company can file a class action lawsuit to represent that worker, rather than that worker having to sue the company all on their own without resources or the necessary time. But third, state democracies have an incentive to ignore corporate transgressions because of how much they contribute to the economy, but also to election campaigns, meaning unions are the only line of democratic defense often that remains. On Team Canada, we think that individual choice and the right of one worker should not come at the expense of the rights of all other workers and their democratic rights in the future, and it is on that principle that we stand. Yes?
Just to clarify, is there only going to be one union per industry?
We think that there, in many cases, would be one union in an industry just because of the fact that single companies tend to dominate that industry, but we're also fine with having competition between unions and industries. We think both are perfectly viable, and we think both protect democracy. Second argument now, the critical mass of resistance. The premise of this argument is that unions derive power from large memberships. In the face of 21st century capitalism, compulsory membership is the only way to ensure unions can still be a relevant check on corporate power. What's the problem we identify in the world today? That corporations are more powerful than ever before. They have larger profit margins, meaning that they can sustain more losses in the short term to prevent unionization in the long run. If Nestle were a country, it would be one of the 40 largest economies in the world. Walmart will be number 25. Also, there's less competition between companies than there has ever been. So most of the Mongolian mining industry is owned by a single Canadian company, meaning workers can't threaten to go work for a competitor because there simply aren't any around, ladies and gentlemen, so they're compelled to stay with that employer. But third, companies are getting far better at union busting, the act of cracking down on unionization. For example, Target, I'll take in a second, will shut down stores in order to prevent unionization. Or Walmart will relocate pro-union workers to disparate locations in other stores so they're not with each other and can't all strike collectively and cause the company a hard time. Yes?
The reason why union busting is prevalent in status quo is because the penalties for union busting is very low. In the event of increase of punitive sanctions for union busting, then isn't that enough deterrents for companies not living in this practice?
Let's do both. That's an excellent idea. Unions are necessary in order to check the power that companies have, and that power is accrued with more more members, because that way more people can strike, which poses a larger threat, and unions get more union dues to use for advocacy. The problem, however, is while corporate power is greater than ever, union membership and union power is dwindling. In the United States, union membership went from 21% in 1983 to 11% in 2015. In Australia, union membership is at 15%, the lowest ever recorded, and only 3 countries have 50% plus union membership. So why is compulsory membership the best way to ensure that the critical mass of workers is achieved to resist corporate power? This is because the reason union membership is dwindling is because of a prisoner's dilemma. Individual workers have the incentive to not contribute to unions, to not have to pay dues, and to not strike, hoping that other workers will stay in the union and they can continue to benefit. The problem is, when workers withdraw from the union is weakened, meaning other workers are encouraged to withdraw as well. This creates a positive feedback loop and a spiral to destruction. The only way to prevent that is for the state to intervene and have compulsory union membership. We would draw the analogy to mandatory voting, because some states recognize that low voter turnout poses an existential threat to democracy, because it means a significant portion of the population forgoes its democratic power, and the only way to solve that is with mandatory voting. We think that this is analogous to what we're trying to do on Team Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, let it not be lost on you the crisis in our midst. Capital is being concentrated in the hands of those that abuse their power at the expense of voiceless billions. It falls to the working class to unite behind a rallying cry or perish. Thank you.
Proposition speakers spend 8 minutes and 40 seconds.
Thank you for the first opposition speaker for your speech. Now let's continue with the case of the opposition. Please welcome Adrian Ventura as the first speaker.
What proposition side wants is unions that are more powerful and better able to advocate for workers' rights. In our first speech, we will show you that their policy does the opposite of what it intends and weakens unions because it dilutes their focus and their capacity to strike. We will also show you the benefits of voluntary unions. In our second speech, we will show you that even in proposition's best case of forced membership, it's an immoral imposition on other members and it worsens outcomes for them. What do we stand for? Firstly, employees should not be compelled to join unions or pay union dues. Secondly, unions should not be forced to represent and collectively bargain for non-union members. Unions should, as they are allowed to in the UK and much of the US, negotiate for and reach agreements only on behalf of their members. Thirdly, to be clear, employees may voluntarily join a labor union. We will make it a criminal offense for employees to be fired, not promoted, or face any discrimination for joining a union, or for employers to dissuade employees from joining unions, basically treating it the same way we do for egregious and violent violations. Note that this criminal deterrent is more than the current sanctions we impose on people, and already responds to their point about union busting, because we have an added disincentive to do so. Unions will still exist on our side. They are smaller than in proposition's world, and many of the people who want to be part of the union feel they gain from membership and agree with the principles of the unions. And unions will need to reach out to these workers and persuade them to join. It is likely that workers, particularly those with fewer skills, will still tend to join unions. For instance, the dock workers' unions in Hong Kong, mining unions such as the National Federation of Mining and Peru, or Unison, which negotiates for these low-class workers. Before moving on to my arguments, some responses. Firstly, I want to dispel this myth that union membership is actually on the decline and corporations are more powerful than before. We think in much parts of the world, union memberships are actually rising in many areas of the developing world, such as China and India. But we also have to interrogate the reason in some instances union memberships are declining, such as the US and Australia. We don't think it's because companies are getting better at union busting or coercing people. We think that in these nations, people are becoming more skilled workers and therefore feel that they have greater bargaining power by themselves than being tied down to the collective wage of the union. No, thank you. And we don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if workers can achieve higher standards for themselves without joining the union. Secondly, they told you that we have a 3-year free rider dilemma, which is why we must compulse unions. Why is this an invalid argument? Because it's not inherent or structural to the fact that unions exist, but simply a legal imposition that we can take away on our side, that's included in our model. For example, in the United States, the National Labor Relations Act prevents unions from actually negotiating for everyone and can restrict their benefits purely to union members. Lastly, the argument they told you is that you need unions to collectively bargain, and the essence of this argument is that more members gives you greater potency in your strike. We're going to show to you why this compulsion actually means you are less likely to strike, and hence are less likely to give the power for these people. First argument, but before that, go ahead.
Should drivers be required to buy auto insurance?
We think if it's consistent with our principles, then we're okay with that, but there are practical considerations that are different, and we're more than happy to have that debate outside of what this debate actually is. But furthermore, we think they have an oversimplistic characterization of corporations trying to bust unions, because we think employers don't always oppose unions as they're useful to have a centralized body, and we think firms don't necessarily oppose direct positions. For instance, they do provide efficiency wages, which are higher than equilibrium wages, because they have incentives to avoid shirking, reduce turnover, and have more attractive, productive members, which if unions can provide independent of compulsory membership, they are willing to negotiate with them. So we don't think that arguments about busting and the free rider dilemma stand. Now, our first argument, why the policy significantly weakens unions, which directly clashes with their point about compulsory membership. When we artificially bloat union membership to include members who are disinterested or who feel their interests do not align with the union, we make striking very difficult. Recognize that unions' primary power comes from their ability to credibly threaten to strike. Striking private profit-seeking companies with the ability to continue their operations without disruption. Thus, their bargaining power comes from their power to strike. It is literally their nuclear option. Note, this does not mean that they have to strike all the time, but that they can demonstrate a capacity to strike over a period of time to push their demand. Just think of the power behind nuclear weapons as an analogy. The credible threat to use nukes is what makes them such an effective deterrent. In the same way, the credible capacity to strike is the same power in the side. Proposition thinks that having a large mandatory membership base makes unions more powerful and credible, but we don't think numbers necessarily means power. We think actually the opposite is true. Why do unions have no credible ability to strike in their world? In their world, unions need a majority of voting members to support the decision to strike. But this majority becomes near impossible to achieve when individuals are forced to join unions. Whether it is a single union or whether it is multiple unions, which they really didn't fail to answer the POI. If it's one union, the decision can only be forced by a vote or indirect vote. If there's multiple unions, they need to coalesce in a confederation to try and get bargaining power, and so they'll still converge to the will of the majority. So why does it become incredible for them to have a strike? Several reasons. First reason, for instance, tier-specific interests cannot be reconciled. Recognize that all workers in an industry or company are not on the same level. You have low-skill workers, you have medium management, and you have senior management. These specific interests cannot be reconciled under a union because they have limited political capital, and companies don't have unlimited money to acquiesce to all these demands. For instance, low-skilled workers may prefer a higher base pay, middle management may prefer more holiday time, and senior management prefers seniority protection such as tenure. No, thank you. We think you can't reconcile this when you have compulsory membership and you only have a vote to strike. Secondly, individuals who disagree with their union's principles and political affiliations. Recognize that one of the key aspects of the principle is supporting a political party or person. We think it's highly unlikely that a Republican union member that's forced to join a Democrat-affiliated union, because those tend to push for their rights, is ever likely to push for the ability to strike because they don't want to strengthen the Democrat union and they're very in time with their principles. But thirdly, I think there's multiple apathetic people because as we said, there's limited capacity for unions to push for policy, and they can only focus on few things at once. Thank you. When you're not invested in what's being asked, you're unlikely to show up for info sessions. No, thank you. You're unlikely to read or respond to newsletters, and you're unlikely to acquiesce in the desires of the others. You have no desire, furthermore, to be inconvenienced by the strike. There's a certainty of lost income for A, a benefit that may not even exist, and B, a benefit that you don't want at all, for the reasons I said before. No, thank you. But last, another reason is that you're skeptical and simply don't believe strikes are effective. Because if you previously believed that they were effective, you would have joined anyway on our side. You think there is a tiny possibility or none that strikes will work, but there is a certainty of lost income. The most famous strikes in popular discourse accessible to you are those that have failed. The miners' strike in the UK failed. The air traffic control strike in the US failed. The government sector strike in Chennai failed. This is all they know, and the calculus for them just doesn't make sense to strike, and they will vote it down. Lastly, you are necessarily resentful about having to pay dues and support union initiatives because you feel that it is extortion. Average union dues in the US add up to $400. That is literally a month of rent for many of these people who are taken away from them. And because you are predisposed to see something as coercive and in a negative light, it is hard to persuade you otherwise. Why can't this be remedied? because we don't think you can force solidarity and build enthusiasm in this context. Because it's almost impossible to engage with disinterested members who won't show up to your meeting, who won't read your newsletters, and who won't acquiesce to your demands. Resentful people are less likely to engage in the process and sacrifice for the others, which is so necessary to have a strike. Thus, with mandatory membership, you have disparate interests, and they will have no strikes. Or even if there are similar interests, there is still a reason to vote against a strike, like the skepticism and resentfulness we told you about. So either they will vote it down in the first instance, or vote to prematurely end strikes when they do happen to happen, which undermines the bargaining power they are seen as unable to mobilize strikes. For instance, a de facto compulsory union in the UK, the Public Sector Civil Service Union, frequently tries to call for strikes, but never in its entire history has it achieved a 50% ballot on the national turnout, and it has never had the capacity to strike. We are betting that the strikes are more effective at representing genuine interests. Maybe they have fewer members, but they're committed to the principles and more willing to strike, providing a credible threat to sustain striking. And companies cannot afford to simply dismiss these unions. It's hard to replace a sizable part of the labor force. We think on our side you provide a greater credible threat to strike. On their side, you don't, because numbers do not equal power.
So the first speaker from the opposition will spend 8 minutes 20 seconds.
From proportion to deliver his speech.
Workers of the world are marred in a society which not only robs them of just political representation, but one which tells them that the very desire to reclaim their democratic agency is a selfish one. For far too long, divide and conquer has been the battle cry of those who have come to own the means of production, and for just as long, it has worked chillingly well to shut the door of the public sphere in the faces of those who the public sphere swore to protect. We can't stand for that on Team Canada. That is why we are still so proud to stand under the case line, united we stand, divided we fall. As the second speaker for Proposition, I will move through some reconstruction of the points that were offered by my partner and refutation of the constructive material we've heard so far from the opposition team, as well as introduce the final contention for side of Proposition, political strength united. What did we hear in terms of refutations from the opposition side? To the idea of democracy in the workplace, we heard one crucial response from side opposition, which is that workers are becoming more skilled and want the ability to decide for themselves what their grievances are and represent themselves when they have those grievances rather than being beholden to unions. What are the issues with that response? My partner gave you several structural reasons for which workers cannot individually express that liberty and go through the process of enacting those grievances. Firstly, the replaceability of labor. The idea that it is extremely easy for these companies to go underneath these workers and introduce new ones to undercut their grievances. Secondly, the fact that there is a massive resource imbalance that my partner points out between these companies. That sometimes a protracted legal battle between the little guy and Exxon will end in Exxon crushingly defeating those grievances regardless of how great they are. And thirdly, the information asymmetry. I'd like to introduce that idea. The fact that a lot of the time, individual workers don't actually know what the comparable work circumstances of other people in that industry are, and unions are the only actors who can collect that data to contend with the information and power that the individual corporations have against them. And fourthly, we would like to point out that the worker shouldn't have to go through this. A worker should not have to make the value judgment of, am I going to put my life savings on the line to bring forward this claim that can help me and people in this company going forward? They should be able to have that whistle to go through, to have powerful unions through which they are integral to their economies. On my partner's second point, they talked about how union busting can be cracked down on more heavily, and how other companies have to compete with these companies, and that causes them to treat their workers better in the first place. However, what we heard is a lack of response to my partner's analysis on the concentration of wealth, power, and control of industries in the status quo, which undercuts the idea they bring about competition among industries. However, on the idea of mitigating union busting, that is a concession, first of all, that unions are a good thing and that sometimes there needs to be strikes and that worker abuses do occur. However, we'd also like to point out that it's impossible to regulate. Companies always have the guise of business policy to justify their decision to shut down a store or move workers around. And we think that the best way to undercut this is to have everybody be a part of those unions. In terms of constructive, they brought forward the idea that unions are weaker together. Firstly, they said that there is no majority ability to get the vote to strike on our side of the House. We say that this is also a concession that striking is sometimes necessary. But secondly, we think that the idea that you get more dues on our side of the House means that unions are more able to pay strike fees, to pay people during strikes, and cause them to be more okay with striking. Secondly, they talked about tension between union values and individual values. However, when you get a vote, and when you pay dues, and when you have say within the structure that you, like my partner, brings to you, you are far more likely to be represented under our side of the House. They thirdly talked about inactive participants in unions. However, we think that weak unions exacerbate the idea of inactivity in people who are passionate about what their unions are doing. And we think that if these dues are so cumbersome, like they say, that incentivizes people to go forth and be active in their unions and make sure their dues are being put towards worthy causes. Secondly, on the idea of extortion, they told us that sometimes these union dues are just too much. However, we think that on a side with strong unions, because of that membership, there's a higher chance that you get good wages, and there is more members, so that means that dues can be slightly lower for all, but we still get the same impact on our side. As an overarching refutation in their case, they claim to want small and active unions and admit that unions are good in mitigating corporate power. What we want is a situation where unions are powerful so they can enact that good. We think the debate is now on the grounds of how do we make unions powerful. That's exactly where we want it here on Science Proposition. My first point is about political strength in numbers. Go first.
Would you force a migrant worker in the UK to join any union that promotes anti-immigrant policy?
Absolutely. We think that it is important for those workers to be a part of those unions because that's the mouthpiece through which they can voice that the unions shouldn't be supporting anti-immigrant policy. When they're paying dues, those immigrants become important to the structure of the union, and they're more likely to be represented, they're less likely to be hated within those industries. Political strength in numbers. Strong unions force political capital for workers to exert pressure on politics. This is our third and final intention. What does this look like and how do they do this? First of all, strong lobbies. We think that high union dues means deep pockets for those unions, which means that as political entities, they have sway. They can speak to what politicians hear, campaign funding, and that is how you push through those policies that benefit workers that they claim to support on their side of the House. Secondly, a strong precedent. Active unions normalize the struggle for workers' rights when they are within the political sphere and when politicians have been lobbying to espouse those views that worker concerns are also important. In the developed world, we think that it is union rage which has given us things like the weekend, given us things like sick leave, given us things like sexual harassment law within the workplace, because unions have made noise on behalf of those who they represent, and we want that to be a strong voice on our side. In the developing world, this quite literally translates to political movements. This looks like the Bourguiba Neo-Destro Party in Tunisia pushing social reform on the back of textile workers supporting the cause. This looks like the reconstruction of Peruvian democracy post-dictatorship through the unions that push forward as political parties. We think that our benefits are unique to a strong union presence because that's where you get the critical mass of support that my partner talked about. We must mandate union participation now to keep these benefits because union enthusiasm is declining in the modern world, like my partner brings you examples of, and is quite frequently refuted by the side of opposition. We think that this sets an ideological norm of collective labor action, which means that it's easier to sell things like a high minimum wage or high welfare, which is good for all workers. We think that worker coffers begin to be a counterbalance to the concentration of political and literal capital that my partner tells you about, and they begin to lobby. We think that the peer effect of mobilization, giving people a vote in union elections, giving them an ability to voice their concerns, letting them know that thousands of others will be voting along the same lines as them in general elections is extremely important to causing workers to be be more active in assessing the way their lives are governed and trying to affect it. In this capitalist game of sink or swim, the life raft is not some grand idea of radical liberty. It is each other. It is our duty to the exploited to extend a hand and help those who bob beneath the surface. If even one goes under, it is tantamount to a failure of us all. Very proud to propose.
So the second proposition team spent 8 minutes and 14 seconds.
I thank the second speaker of the proposition team. Now we continue to the case of opposition. Please welcome Ignacio Villarreal.
Ladies and gentlemen, note that all the arguments of Team Canada today are contingent on the premise that these unions become stronger. Their argument that they're good democratic check against corporations, their argument that it's better for the rights of workers, are contingent on them proving that more numbers equals power. We told you that's a lie. That just because you have more numbers doesn't mean you'll have the greater potency to strike and be able to affect policies. So if we're able to prove to you that they get weaker, all the arguments fall. But what I'm going to bring to you in my speech today is going to shoot their best case, where even if they become stronger under the rest of the House, why it's an immoral imposition on these individuals that we can never accept. But before that, a few reputations. First, they try to respond to our point about these unions becoming more impotent and diluted. They say that not being able to strike will be able to be compensated by the fact that they have higher strike pay because they have more members to pay labor union dues. Yes, you have more members paying dues, but you also have more members to take into account. So we don't think it will have higher strike pay for these workers. We don't think that will prevent them from being able to not want to have the costs of entering a union. The next thing they said about how they incentivize union membership to join the strikes is that it's the current cycle of apathy and status quo, and if they're part of the union, they're less likely to be apathetic. We told you that apathy and the distrust of these unions becomes further reinforced the point in which they feel like it's a coercive choice for them, that they're forced to join a union that they don't necessarily consent to, and it's extortion for them that they have labor dues. We don't think they're like to love unions in their set house. We think they're more likely to be opposed to unions, knowing that their money that they worked hard for is being taken away by organizations that don't necessarily represent them. So to this point, they have to prove to us why they'll get the majority vote necessary to get strikes, because if they're unable to do so, even if they have a lot of people, their unions become weak. So we think that they're unable to prove why the right to strike becomes better than the rest of the House. But secondly, they say, but even if we don't get the right to strike, we're able to increase political representation and political power, things like greater lobbying. First, we deny the premise that we think workers' needs are so denied by the political system of today. Because while they might have less money, they have more votes that are able to shape the political field. Take, for example, in the US, when Trump was elected, despite corporate interests and corporate lobbying supporting Hillary Clinton trying to fund their campaign. Or the case of Brexit, where corporations definitely wanted free trade to support their interests, but it was the workers' groups who were a big majority of votes that politicians had to cater to and were able to win. So we deny the premise that they are so disenfranchised by society. No thank you. But secondly, assuming that unions are so powerful under their side to affect public policy, we think that's not necessarily a good thing. Because if they push for policies, it will only benefit members of the union and not necessarily other workers and other stakeholders in society. An example of this, for instance, would be if they push for a $20 minimum wage, then they will prevent other people from being able to be employed, because unemployment rates will go high inherently if you increase the minimum wage to really high extents. So we don't think they're able to cater to the majority of the population, assuming their political representation is there. But lastly, no thank you, I'll say why it's immoral to force individuals to be represented by these unions in terms of their political ideology. Then they talked about the coercion of workers. Now, a lot of workers want to join unions, but are unable to do so because of things like union busting. We already told you why our model is different from status quo and increases the deterrence because we criminally punish it. But secondly, we think A lot of times, companies are averse to legal battles. And even if they can hire rich lawyers, they don't want to have a legal battle or a suit against them because that destroys their publicity and destroys their stock value. An example of this, for instance, was when Tesla was sued by a union, like members who were like their employees, their stock value decreased by 10%. So we think that companies were more likely to settle these organizations and prevent union busting from taking place. But even if, assuming these are the corporations and don't care about the human rights of workers and care about violating the law to destroy these unions, they're likely to infiltrate the union members under their set house by bribing members within the union who are joining to vote for policies that goes against their policy, so we don't think they're able to fix that problem under their set house as well. Lastly, they said that unions are what are able to fight for the rights of the people. We conceded. But note that all the examples that they provided, like the French unions in Europe, the Peruvian unions, are all unions that were voluntary in nature and didn't require compulsory membership. Meaning they're proving that voluntary unions can be effective in fighting for rights. They haven't shown to us why it has to be involuntary membership. Let's move on then to the argument. Let's assume that the best case scenario where you do have strikes and the ability to advocate for policies. We'll show you why this policy is morally illegitimate and harms the most vulnerable of workers. It is illegitimate in 3 ways. First, that not everyone is able to strike. Second, that not everyone shares the interests of the median union. And third, that unions cannot compel people to support political parties. First, not everyone is able to strike. We think that some individuals are just unable to strike. Think about immigrants who don't have enough support networks to support themselves when not working, or someone who has little savings, for instance, or a mother who has many children to pay for and has to live paycheck to paycheck. We think that they are incredibly damaged to protect you by their side because they're being forced to strike and reduce their capacity to earn income. Even if they have strike pay, we told you why that's not enough because he strikes for long periods of time. But even if it's beneficial for them in the long term, a lot of these individuals can't wait for the long term and have to rely on the short term for them to be able to live. We think that restricting someone's ability to work and forcing them to make their family go hungry and suffer in the name of a political cause is a demand the state will never make for its citizens. It's an infringement of their basic human rights to live, and I think it's unproblematic. But secondly, what about individuals who can go to strike but usually have interests under conflict or fight against the unions? We think that even if the majority of the union is represented, individuals will still inherently be left out because they're interested in labor that are not inherently aligned. We talk about the UK's Unite Union, for instance, which advocates for anti-EU policies, which mean that migrant workers within that union would have been inherently disenfranchised. Even if they can lobby for their policies, it's either they choose between a pro-immigration policy or an anti-immigration policy. What happened in the manufacturing industry, for instance, most employees who are men are likely to fight for higher pay because they don't have to take care of women, while women and other people with dependents are less likely to want higher pay but want more time for their families. We think that unions forbid them from negotiating with these employers on terms that they want and are forced them to fight for terms that are not useful to them. We think it's unacceptable to force workers to pay dues or to commit to strikes when their interests are ignored. We would rather that these members fight or negotiate in their own means, in their own terms with their employers, or in the worst case, at the very least, they don't get anything that they want, not pay for union dues that don't represent their interests. They're still comparatively better under our set of house. But lastly, we think that unions compel people to support political goals that they might not agree with. They themselves said that they will inherently have to get lobbying power and support political parties that might not be in line with their own interests. An example of this, for instance, would be a political party like in Brazil, where the CUT union was supported by the worker, like by President Lula, even if despite all the corruption allegations that took place. Why do you think this is fundamentally unfair? We think that in any democracy, everyone should have a right to the democratic representation and choose who they want to be able to be represented. Their side, they're chained to the politicians that the labor unions support. So we think it's principally unjustified for us to be able to do so. And because we've proven to you why it's not working for the unions and why it's immoral to do so, we're very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Second opposition speaker span 8 minutes and 9 seconds.
I thank the second speaker of the opposition team for your speech. Now please welcome the third speaker of the proposition, Dasha Metropolitansky.
does it mean for this debate when opposition takes this stance? It means two things. First, it means that both sides in this debate recognize that there is a problem, that companies are exploitative and there is power asymmetry. We have the same goal. So you have to weigh which side has the better mechanism for achieving the end goal. But second of all, their point about unions being good but it should be voluntary weakens a lot of the other lines of analysis that they try to run. Namely, it weakens their point about the unions being inherently bad when they do things like not being individualized, when they do things like lobbying for the $20 minimum wage. They're okay with all of those things that are inherent to unions and how they operate. They're just saying that it shouldn't be compulsory membership. The difference between the two teams in this debate is that we both recognize that there are good and bad parts of unions. But the question becomes, are people able to make a free and fair choice that will ensure that they can protect themselves and their fellow workers? We say that they're in a position right now where they can't, and in order to maximize the good parts of unions, everyone has to be tied to the collective well-being. That being said, two areas of clash. First, freedom of choice of the worker, and second of all, better protections for workers in the workplace. Looking firstly at the freedom of choice. The major claim that we get from opposition is that it is principally unjustified to compel workers to be a part of a union. The strongest case that we got from this came from the second op speaker, which is the material about you shouldn't be forcing, for example, a poor worker to have to go on strike. A couple of responses here. First, the probability of a strike occurring is very, very low because there are very specific circumstances where it can take place. It can only take place when there's a negotiation for a collective bargaining agreement where there hasn't been any resolution to that collective bargaining agreement. The union has to provide a period of notice before they actually go on strike. Moreover, the union itself doesn't have an incentive to go on strike unless it's the very worst case scenario. Their workers literally are not being paid. They have to pay them from the dues that are collected. This is to say, what I'm trying to prove here is the point that they're resting a lot of their impacts on is very unlikely. So you have to weigh that risk against the certainty that if a worker doesn't have union protection, they won't be paid for the overtime work that they do. That the woman who was sexually assaulted by her boss won't have any legal closure for that instance. So there is a chance that a strike could be harmful for someone who's poor, but the certainty of the greater magnitudes of harm to their basic dignity and protection is far, far greater. The other arguments that we get about compulsory union membership being wrong is just like workers should be able to choose who represents them. It's unfair to compel them into a union. This is what we get from the first speech. My first response here is to mitigate the extent or the magnitude to which this is a violation of freedom of choice that individuals have. If everyone is paying dues, first of all, the financial due that everyone has to pay, the amount goes down. But second of all, you're still able to vote. You still have the right to vote for whatever party you want to vote for. We're saying that it's beneficial for everyone to vote for things that will protect all workers, but you still have political agency. Second of all, what I've heard no response to from team opposition is as to why it is a free and a fair choice that people have. Because choice isn't an end in and of itself, it's an end to the point at which people are able to make better decisions for themselves. I've heard no response to the prisoner's dilemma that we gave you on proposition. Even if they have harsher penalties against union busting, I've heard no response to the idea that what companies can do is they can offer a slightly lower wage than the union wage, but because that's still going to be lower than the amount that workers would have to pay with the union due, they will always opt out of unions. So even if they're not doing things like masking up store closures with renovations or those sorts of things, there will always be a self-interest reason to opt out, which weakens that union for everyone. No response to that point whatsoever. Here's a critical response that I give you, though. Let's think about the two groups of people that prop and opt are protecting. They're saying that they're individuals who would like to represent themselves. But the reality is, the principal proposition is you shouldn't be forced to represent yourself. If you are the woman who was sexually assaulted, you shouldn't be told that you have to go by yourself to confront your boss. If you're the janitor who was forced to work overtime with no pay, you shouldn't be forced to go to the negotiating table. What they do is, even if there are some people who are capable of negotiating for themselves and would like to do so, their decision and their liberty to be able to do so should undermine everyone else's right to have someone to be able to negotiate for them. And that's why compulsory membership is so important. I want to look at the second area of clash, which is representation for unions and for workers and how that improves. The major claim that we get here is that the tool that unions have to protect workers is the ability to strike, and it becomes far less effective when workers feel like they're coerced into membership. They will be active don't vote to do so, the fact that that threat exists is powerful. But thirdly, this argument relies on the link that when you force people to go into a union, they'll now hate it and be unwilling to comply with its policies. Their own characterization undermines that link, even if they haven't substantiated that. The reason is, in their first speech, they tell you that in many parts of the world, people are actually joining unions more and more. People are seeing a push to protect themselves, particularly among the lower class. If it is true on the opposition side of the House that people are seeing the benefits of union membership and of being a part of a union, why should I also believe that over 50% of people wouldn't vote to have a strike if it was so important to them? Next claim that we get, actually, yeah, go ahead.
Ma'am, if you concede that you need to have a threat to strike, how are you going to do that if your membership of the union is diluted by members who don't want to be part of the union to begin with?
Okay, thank you. Our two claims are, first of all, we contest that is a sizable portion of people. Most people want access to basic protections, like being paid for their overtime work, having legal counsel if they need it. But second of all, the fact that everyone is just part of a union in the first place means that you can't have coercive union busting measures, means that the company knows that if there were to be a strike, they can't just fire everyone. Last thing we want to deal with is about individualized benefits, which is that unions can't represent the needs of every single worker. I would contest that this is true. Unions actually do a pretty good job of this. Unions are oftentimes industry and area specific, so you'll have a union for example, factory workers in Bristol, factory workers in London, that will set different wages based on the needs of those workers. They also provide comprehensive benefits packages, so like maternity leave, sick leave pay, that cover a wide range of needs. But critically, even if these needs that unions provide for aren't as individualized as possible, opposition has been unable to prove to you why they get a broader range of the critical protections that all workers need, like basic workplace safety laws, and ensure that those laws are complied with. What are you left with at the end of this debate? Both sides agree on the same end goal, which is having stronger unions. The question becomes, do you have stronger unions when companies are able to use coercive members to say that you shouldn't join that union? Do you have stronger unions when individual workers feel like if they join that union, they won't be represented, so they never join it in the first place? Do you have stronger unions when you make decisions based on one individual's will to represent themselves at the expense of the collective? Proposition stands for all workers, and that's why we're incredibly proud to propose.
So result proposition, speaker span 8 minutes 32 seconds.
Proposition speaker for her speech. Now let's continue the case of opposition. Please welcome Abhishek Patamashu.
In this debate, what Side Canada repeatedly said so passionately, so rhetorically, was that what the government wanted was political representation, what the government wanted was a desire to be heard, and what the government wanted was for the people to have their rights of workers. The problem is that they don't contest with the fact that all these things that government wants won't happen in their world, and what will happen is the exact opposite. That is why Side Canada simply can't win this debate. In this debate, I have two issues for you. First of all, whether this actual mandatory labor union membership will be effective in terms of getting the benefits that they so want on their side. And second of all, whether it is actually morally legitimate for us to force this mandatory membership as a burden on these people. So first, the issue of whether it will be so effective in translating to your benefits. What did Side Opposition come and tell you on this? We told you that artificially bloating membership is harmful, that the power to bargain comes from your power to strike because you can withhold labor. That is a bargaining chip you have. That is an advantage you have against the people. We also gave the analogy of the nuclear example of how the possibility of having nuclear weapons is credible deterrence. What did they say on this? They said that this was the only point that was resting on our case, that generally people are averse to strikes, and that this is generally rarely done. Yes. What we say, though, is that in your world, they'll be more averse. They'll have less strikes, and we gave reasons for this. What was the reasons for our case? We gave 5 different layers of analysis that they didn't really care about, and they homogenized as a whole. We told you how they're different kinds of people, how they're tire-specific industries that cannot be reconciled. For example, low-skilled people wanting higher wages, and senior officials wanting tenure. We also gave you examples of people with incompatible political views if you're a Republican and fighting democracy. Another example of the apathetic people who don't want to be inconvenienced. And lastly, how you're resentful that you are being extortioned. What did we hear about this? They homogenized this and said, oh, these people are not a sizable portion of the people because most people want benefits, so they'll be willing to strike. No, thank you. They didn't clearly prove the link why wanting benefits is going to lead to the actual strike. Leaving your job and leaving your income that you have guaranteed. Because we gave you an analysis about how strikes don't have certain incomes. Strikes are up in the air whether they'll be effective or not. But losing your income for the day because you didn't go to job is guaranteed. So why will people make this moral calculus and this logical, rational calculus? They're more likely not going to do so. Yes. Next, in engaging with this idea of they're going to be resentful, they're going to be extortion, they said the cumbersome dues are enough incentive for people to go, and this is so effective when they get good membership. No, thank you. I don't really see why, if you're going to be asked to pay $400, why you'd want to be further inconvenienced by having your presence there. You're going to rather be like, screw these people, they already took my money, I don't even want to help them. I don't like them, and that is not my cause that I want to support. So until they prove in their reply speech, if they really want to, why these different 5 layers of analysis, why the striking will actually happen, they can't really win this debate. Sure.
Your mechanism relies on people voluntarily joining a union. If these people really don't want to be part of the union and they feel like their dues are being taken from them, why would they join unions under your side of the house?
If they don't join the unions, it's perfectly fine with us. The people who are part of our unions in the status quo, they can effectively strike because their membership is out of their own volition. That means the effectiveness is there, and the unions can be getting all the benefits that they want. The people who don't want to be part of the union, that is their choice. If they want to do so, that's perfectly fine with us. We don't really see why this is a problem. Now, what did we hear from Side Canada on this issue of the practicality? They said, oh, the critical mass of resistance. That was their argument. Corporations have profit margins, they can avoid unions, companies will union bust, all that. We gave you analysis of how legal means can deal with this, how you can criminalize it and all that. And they conceded that sure, you can have legal means to prevent people from firing, but you can still have business policies that separate workers location-wise that makes them preventing from striking. This doesn't really make sense because in the 21st century, you don't need to physically talk to the person to convince them to strike. You can simply send them a message on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. That doesn't really make sense why separating them physically is going to harm their ability to strike. Then, they said that the power comes with the numbers, striking is so important, and this strike will be so effective. They still don't understand that their whole benefits are hinged on the fact that you can strike. So insofar as you believe and we prove to you that you cannot strike in this world, that you cannot, because of all the reasons we provided to you, all the benefits and all the practical things they can get are really not going to stand. Then there's us, Deputy Case, no thank you, of how strong unions put pressure and you can get greater lobbying, the things like weekends, sick leave, and all that. No thank you. What we gave you analysis about that was wholly unresponded to is that in the status quo, even if the people of workers have less money, they have power. We gave you examples of how they were so effective in making Trump oppose free trade deals and so effective in causing them to UK to leave the EU. No thank you. So until they prove why this is not the power that they want, why they want more power, this idea of political lobbying, collective action bargaining, the whole practical case there doesn't really stand. No thank you. So because we've proven that all their benefits are hinged on the possibility to strike, and you cannot strike in the real world, their practical case doesn't really stand. But let me tell you about whether it's morally legitimate or not. The second issue that I'll talk about. No thank you. What did we tell you? The deputy case of our second speaker was that it is morally illegitimate. Because you cannot force people to strike because some people simply need the money they are saving. Other people who are immigrants, they don't have the job stability yet and they're going to be uncertain to do so. Then we gave you further analysis of how all the interests may not be in unison and this may not be coherent. And lastly, the idea that you cannot, and how it's principally illegitimate for us to force people and force feed them to political goals that you don't simply support. What did we hear from them? It was really sparse response about our deputy's case. What did they say? On the first idea of how everyone would not want to strike, they only said that we'll have strike pays. If membership increases proportionally to the number of funds you get, why will the strike pay increase as opposed to status quo? That doesn't really make sense. You're not suddenly going to get more money in their world. You're just going to get a proportional amount of money. Then, what was their response to the second scenario of the idea that the interests won't be in unison? And this example we gave you is that sometimes a union will fight for their own interests and not for the interests of the people. This idea that they'll give a $20 minimum wage even if it leads to unemployment. They only said that companies will actually give wages lower than the unions. Then why in the world will people want to work for those companies if they're not listening to the union demands? How will the union be so effective if you're going to dilute the effects of the union gain for you? Then we gave you how it's so illegitimate for us to compel people to support political goals. And the only thing they said is, you still have a vote, you can still use your power, but this concession, that you still have power, diminishes the idea of lobbying and their whole case about that, because if people have the power to fight for their own political beliefs, and in this one big union that you have all these different political beliefs, how can you get lobbying? There's going to be infighting, that's going to be so ineffective from their side, they didn't really prove that. Now, what do we hear from them on the idea of the legitimacy? They said democracy in the workplace, even though they didn't really understand that they're violating the principles of democracy in our case. They said that power imbalances and all that, you have asymmetry in the world, and you said the free rider dilemma is so morally wrong. We can see that the free rider dilemma is morally wrong, but that is not necessarily the case. We see that many laws are in place for people to not fight for people outside the unions. Then they said that the state democracies ignore the corporate transgression. It really sounded like a practical case. They didn't really give more legitimacy, but we still think that the unions don't have an incentive to do so. Now, in conclusion, if we have proved to you, and if you believe that either unions have a credible power to do not have a credible power to strike, or that it is principally illegitimate for us to force this mandatory membership, either of this are enough to win this debate. And because we have proven both to you, we clearly take this debate. I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
So the third opposition speaker spent 8 minutes 25 seconds.
We agree with accusations coming from proposition that we did concede that unions can be a force for good and that sometimes the right to strike is necessary. What we argued in today's debate was that you can't do these things and they become less of a force for good under your side when they become less effective. And so far, they haven't been able to prove that numbers inherently equal power the already use this debate. But we went beyond. We told you that even if they're able to get more powerful unions under their side, it's still morally wrong for us to be able to do so. And it boils down to two questions. Where are unions more effective, and is it moral to force people to join unions? First, where are unions more effective? Proposition ran the case line that great numbers equals power. But they conceded themselves that a lot of times these unions won't go on strike, and it's about the threat to be able to strike that's important in today's debate. So it's not about the strength of the strikes, but ability of the union to enter into a strike to begin with. And that's where opposition entered into today's debate. Because we told you that they will be very, very unlikely to strike if you have unions that are diluted by members who don't believe in what the unions stand for, who say that they don't want to be part of unions to begin with. We gave you 5 reasons why they're very unlikely to strike. To talk about the difference of tiers within an industry, the political affiliation, the apathy that is reinforced by theirs at the House, the skepticism and the resentfulness you have towards these unions. All they said was that they will continue to strike for two failed assumptions. First, they said that because everyone wants better working conditions, and therefore everyone will be willing to strike anyway. We tell you it's a very simplistic analysis of what better working conditions are. Because for a single mother, a better working condition might mean longer time to spend with their family. But for a male person who doesn't have children, probably means higher pay. How do they solve it in their house? When a union, for instance, wants to fight for higher pay, then you won't get the demographic of mothers who want to be able to have longer working conditions. So we don't think they're able to get a consensus on what better conditions mean. But secondly, even if they're able to do so, what they told you is the costs of entering into a strike to begin with make it very unlikely for you to fight for a strike because of your being dependent on entering into a strike. We gave you reasons as why individuals wouldn't want to risk short-term gain for the long-term speculative benefit, and we think that they're not able to get a strike to get that one on their accounts. What's the comparison? We told you that on our side, yes, unions will have less members, and the strikes might not be as potent when they're able to do so. But at the very least, we're able to get a greater ability to strike and ability for you to be able to say we will be able to strike because we get the votation necessary because the members of that union are actually passionate about the cause. That is a better benefit for the unions as compared to the Jackson House where they might have more potency but less ability. But so we were able to prove to you then that unions become less effective, and all the arguments are contingent on that if you're going to win the debate. But even if you're not able to do so, is it morally right to force people to join unions? Recognize that the entire principled argumentation coming from there at the House was to say that we want to be able to protect workers. We said that a lot of times these workers can't be protected. And yes, maybe some people are influenced by union busting. We have measures to mitigate that. But there's a huge demographic of individuals that, despite not having union busting, wouldn't want to be part of the union. I gave you them in my speech. People who can't take part in strikes because they don't have money to do so. People who don't agree with the policy of the strike. People who have no political representation, don't want to be represented by these labor unions. We think that if your underlying principle is to protect these vulnerable workers, you're not able to do so if you coerce them into an environment where they have to pay labor dues, or they have to stop working just because you want to fight for a cause that doesn't benefit them. And if you're a migrant worker, ladies and gentlemen, we won't think it's right to force you to fight for a lobby group that says that you cannot be represented or you cannot work in this area because you want better working conditions for the majority. Let us not be lied to in this debate. They're not better for labor unions, and they're not better for the vulnerable minority groups. We're very proud to take this debate.
From the opposition team span 4 minutes, 18 seconds.
And now to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon Armin Salabi.
The big mistake Team Philippines made in this debate was that they didn't focus on the full scope of the threat that working class people in large industries face around the world. Maybe it's true unions won't work for everyone. Maybe it's true some people have it worse than others. But Team Philippines had no alternative to fighting back against these bastions of global capital that the global poor are confronted with today. I'm going to look at this debate in two themes. First, protecting workers, and second, principle. First, under protecting workers, Team Philippines has a rather problematic stance. They say people will be upset being forced to join unions because they have to pay dues. But they rely on voluntary membership, in which people also have to pay dues. This means that according to Team Philippines' own analysis, there is no way people will want to voluntarily join unions on their side, which weakens any analysis they have on showing any alternative to fighting back, especially when Team Canada gave you explicit analysis on why unions were necessary to fight this battle in a way states cannot. But what else did Team Philippines do? They told you that it's hard to get a strike to happen. On Team Canada, we told you it's a strategic mistake, first of all, to hang their whole case on striking. because we had two constructive arguments full of other benefits unions give. Class action lawsuits, advocacy, the ability to politically lobby governments, things Team Philippines were never able to successfully refute. But second, Team Canada contended that people wouldn't want to strike. Team Canada said that the reason people don't want to do it now is because they hope that other people will do it instead and they won't have to do it. That's the prisoner's dilemma. So once they are actually in the union, once they are paying the dues, they're not going to be against it themselves. But let's say Team Philippines is right and people won't strike very often. Then the comparative is this. Very frequent but totally ineffective strikes because they don't have a critical mass, or one or two extremely effective strikes that ensure that corporations are held at bay. So again, Team Philippines' alternative in this debate was powerless for all the time they spent mitigating ours. Team Philippines said, it's perfectly said that they need simply better state policies to regulate against corporations. But Team Canada asks, who's going to enforce those policies, ladies and gentlemen, when the states are beholden to the will of corporations? What political arm is best equipped to represent workers in the absence of the state on their side? Down the bench, Team Philippines ignored this crucial reality. Now, I'd like to move on to the principle, something that Team Canada tried to POI a lot in the last few speeches of Team Philippines' case. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to speak. Team Canada told you that there's a free rider dilemma, which means everyone should contribute to what they benefit from. Team Philippines said that they can regulate against that and gave the example of US union laws. But Team Canada pointed out that those same laws that allow unions to only represent their union members means that corporations can offer slightly lower prices to people outside of the union, incentivize people to leave the union, and undermine all of their policies about trying to prevent union busting in the first place. Team Canada told you that individual choice is to withdraw from a union is less important than the democratic rights of other people. Team Philippines said it's immoral to force everyone to participate because not everyone benefits all the time, and that have to pay dues in other words. On Team Canada, we told you two things. First of all, that people still have control over what goes on in unions because they have a vote. Would they be opposed to people paying taxes to government simply because they have different politics than they do? Are they opposed? Like, this is the analogy to democracy Team Canada has been making since the first speech. But even more than that, we told you on Team Canada that this is a threat that can only be dealt with in one way. So even if it's true that our family is hard-pressed to pay that due, their wage will plummet even further down if there remains not a single institution that can represent them. It is in this battle against the corporate monolith that Team Canada is proud to propose.
The next speech from the proposition is by 67.
Thank you for all the speakers. Now please for everyone to read through while the judges complete their notes.
Very cool. Okay, you can go first with what you need to decide. were able to prove that the numbers are not rising, and they questioned that many times whether the numbers equal more effective. And I don't think they were able to really gush and show it all the way, even though they had good points coming on. Then the third speaker, even though she was good, but there are, I don't know where, but the major thing that I have is that they were assuming many things that were actually analyzed and shown that this is not the case. You should not take it into a big mass and sort of read
numbers aren't going to make sense on like superficial level. Yes, we have to get masses, but it's very easy to call them bluff when you know that the other things like resource level also exist, and the likelihood of this never happening also exists. And this becomes particularly telling when you start examining who are the people who can really strike, and whether they really want to strike, and how do they view their rational metrics to measure like strikers to get money, even if they're different people with different needs and requirements, right? So I think on those levels we can make clear that
And as much as we're not supposed to put in our own
I'm not thinking of you guys did all the way this one. This is pretty much yeah, and it's like very clear as a principle. So I think the only things that were left that would have probably one candidate to debate was could you tell me that this coercion is good at some level? And where the only arguments we got were like South members who meet in the union, you know, it's good to have the numbers like the bargaining power, and I don't think that they were sufficient enough. Like even the things that they really want to talk about, like the class action, they're trying not to talk about. So the bigger things that could have driven, you know, coercion for benefits didn't really come through by the end of the case. So yeah, that's what I think. We didn't miss anything.
She wanted it now. I was
Do you have anything else to add?
strategy definitely were
I
slightly.
think they were like bang on, like they went for it.
Yeah.
I was very impressed. I personally tried to discuss the issue of thrice yesterday so that they would prep.
And tight case, it was a case that was tight and consistent.
I think these guys were not expecting this. I think the second speaker protocol is
Yeah.
Unsalary.
Okay.
I would actually say, I would really say, I mean like, I won't say it in terms of, you want to something like, maybe like, I think,
That was the one that gave me the lowest point, and
I mean like, I was mentioning like, you know what, like the case was very well positioned after the first speakers, and I think at that point you had to answer these questions. And I think you got called out in the first 10 seconds and numbers do not mean everything. You have to answer that question. You have to answer choice. Choice can't be answered by Dasha and time. Like it's your thing. Right? So let me just get the both teams get pumped.
Sorry?
How do we do this? What are the results? You actually call the teams and say, what I want to do is the math now. I'll do the results stuff. Figure it out so I can update the results online. Cool, thanks. To do the back tab now, I'm going to. I'm the back tab. Are you on the roaming? Kill your roaming then, right?
It's outside.
Oh.